Coming up, we take a look at the Brooklyn Nets and the remaining 24 games on the schedule. What are their chances to make the playoffs, to get out of the play-in if that's where they fall? And what are the expectations for this new look roster, both in the short and long term, as Sean Marks and Jacques Vaughn construct the Brooklyn Nets for the foreseeable future?
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And we let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And Doug, it's all behind us, my friend. The trades, the speculations, the rumors. We got a coach for the long term, a GM for the long term, and a bunch of talented guys on the roster. Before we dive in on expectations for the remainder of this season, what are the betting numbers say the expectations should be for the rest of this season?
Well, we'll go into some of the odds here in 1 second. One thing I just want to clarify from yesterday's episode that we did not touch on was around the length of the Jacques Vaughn. So we kind of jumped on right after the Jacques Vaughn signing and did not know the length of the contract. We now know that and this has to do a little bit, I think, about sort of our views around the rest of the season too. We know now that his contract is through 26-27. So it's for the next 4 years, which is actually longer than any player that they currently have under contract, which I thought was interesting. Like, I thought that was good.
And that's right on the cusp of when some of those valuable draft picks could come into effect there, 28, 29. So like you're right in between, right? Play out this and also set the table for someone else to maybe be in charge.
So I thought that was an interesting just kind of number. And look, you're always, if you're anyone that's going for a contract and negotiating a contract, you're always going for length. So I don't think it's like all tied to these players, right? Right. And some of these guys are going to re-sign, whoever they end up kind of re-signing for longer extensions, whatever. So all this will change very quickly. I just did find that interesting. One, it's just very long. Like, it's just that's a long commitment to make to a coach. And so and it was actually longer than I would have guessed what would have been it when we did it at the time. So I wanted to clarify that real quick before we get into this other stuff.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and set the table for the rest of this season. On the back end of the episode, that does trigger another thought for me around expectations for this iteration of the team.
Okay, so let's just take a lay of the land here where the Nets are as we head out of the All-Star break. They play Friday. It will be coming to you live on YouTube following the game on Friday, so make sure you are around for that. 34-24, fifth in the East, 7.5 back from the top ranked Boston. They are 2.5 games out of the play-in right now over the Miami Heat, who are 32-27. They are 8.5 games out of like just the lottery, right? Which is where the Bulls are at 26-33. So that's just a real quick sort of high level look of where the Nets sit now. If you go to some different spots to just grab some of these numbers, our friends over at Tankathon have the Nets as the 7th strongest schedule remaining at 5-12. So they have a slightly more difficult schedule from here on out for the final 24 games. Though if you go over to 538 and look at their Raptor projected model, the Nets actually have the 7th highest. Did this drop a little bit? No, sorry. Yeah, they have the I just skipped right over them. They have this because they were so high. They have this. Nets have the 8th best odds to make the playoffs right now at 90%, which I found to be interesting. And of course, Raptor is taking in the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are no longer on the team. It's just kind of more about where their record sits right now. So anyway, when you hear those numbers, when you see like stronger strength of schedule, when you see 90% chance of the playoffs for the Nets, according to Raptor, which is pretty good at this kind of stuff and prognostication. What are you sort of thinking around this team when it comes to just like their short-term prospects and like sort of what to expect over this last handful of games?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a high level, when you look at the standings, and I'm assuming, when you talk about playoffs, that's the playing games as well. So you go all the way down to the 10th seed, the Toronto Raptors. They have 31 losses. So the Nets are 7 up in the loss column on them. So you talk about 90% chances to make the playoffs. Yeah, they should be, because even just from what other teams, every other team behind them would need to do to get over top of them and knock them out, that's a heavy lift over 24 games, right? I mean, the Nets would have to, if we're thinking about expectations, the Nets would need to be 5, 6, 7 games under 500 combined with a pretty big run for these other teams to get over the top of them. And I think they have the Bucks mixed in here over the back end of the schedule as well. That's some of the difficulty of the strength of schedule. But I'm fascinated by a couple of different things. We've seen them play 500 basketball to this point. I think this All-Star break came at the right time after all of these trades to figure some more things out from a rotation standpoint and just playing together and having a little bit more consistency quarter by quarter. Those things I think benefit them. I expect them to play at least 500 basketball, I think, over the remainder of their schedule. Haven't looked at every single opponent that lines up. And then the other benefit is, some of these teams you may take on, where are they in the hierarchy of the standings? Because that's going to impact teams that start to rest the last couple of games down the stretch, preparing for their run in the playoffs, etc. So I think it all breaks right to me. This is a talented enough team. We've talked about this. They're a really good defensive team. They're going to give you fits on that end of the court, as long as they figure out how to have consistent scoring with Mikal Bridges, Dinwiddie. We'll talk about Cam Thomas. As long as they can check those boxes, I find it kind of hard to think they're going to fall out of the playoffs in just 24 games.
Yeah, look, and just a point of clarification, I think the playoffs here does not include play-in. I think it does include, it just means playoffs, like going to the playoff series. Now, I will say about that, though.
That also means getting out of the play-ins then, right?
Well, this is what I mean, because when you're out of because here's the thing, when you're out of the play-in, then your chances are 100%, one. But two, just the fact that you're above the play-in here, every spot you are above 7, or even if you're in 7, because then it's a home game and win 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then it's 8 and it's an away game, but you win 1 and you're still in, right? So these every step above 10 does make a huge difference with that. And they have banked so many wins at this point because of just how good they were for that huge stretch over December and December plus, that they are in a situation where, I mean, we've seen stranger things happen, but they just are in a situation where it feels inconceivable. And two more things. I know you want to say something. One is, one kind of important game will happen really quickly here on Sunday against Atlanta, because Atlanta is one of those teams fighting for the play-in. If they win that Atlanta game, you're going to see those odds creep up a little bit more, because they'll just have separated themselves by one more game. And also, I made me think of this, because you said they were they're 500 in this stretch around the trade deadline. I remember they're a Dinwiddie millisecond away from being 3-1. Right. That in
the first game without Bridges or Johnson,
he hit that buzzer beater.
That's right.
And it was off, and it was out, it was short by 0.2 seconds or something like that. They would have been 3-1. I know you can't do that because it doesn't count, but the stretch has been okay. Yes. Right. And since the trade deadline.
So coming up here in a second, I want to explain why, even in the play-in scenario, the Nets are in a really good position to officially make the playoffs, and then also break down expectations for these individual players over these final 24.
All right, we are past the midway point of the NBA season. It's a perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. New customers are going to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's a bonus bet back if your first bet doesn't win. You just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Safe, secure, super easy to use. Getting choked up about how much I like FanDuel. You can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers to threes drain. They still got Nick Claxton plus 950 at that Defensive Player of the Year. It's dropped a little bit over there on FanDuel, so I don't love to see that, but I got to look. FanDuel knows what they're doing over here. They know the playing time might be going down a little bit. Maybe he's kind of they're going to coast a little bit here toward the end of the season. FanDuel gets it, and you can get it too. You have to go over to our friends over on FanDuel. Lets you combine bets together for a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Like I said, you're going to get that no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Okay, so first, real quick, just on the playoffs and play-in scenario, and you mentioned there about Atlanta, that is a big game. It's worth noting that 3 of their next 4 games coming out of the All-Star break, now these are all going to be on the road except for the home game against the Bucks. It's Chicago, Atlanta, and then the New York Knicks, who sit right behind the Brooklyn Nets and beat them, obviously, in their last meeting, snapping that winning streak that the Nets had had. But why those are all significant is that even Chicago, because guess what? The Nets could fall behind every team that's behind them down to 10. They'd still be 10th. And in the play-in game, you need Chicago to get over them as well. So they can do a bit of nice work for themselves, controlling their destiny if they beat specifically the Knicks. You said Atlanta and then even Chicago. Get those wins. Get 2 out of 3, however they come, and you put yourself in that much better of a scenario. On top of which, I'll just say that when we look down to the play-in teams, which are Miami, Atlanta, Washington, and Toronto, you're going to be hard-pressed to tell me that, and by the way, because we've seen the sample size against those teams after the stars were traded, and especially with Miami, I feel good. I'm not saying I'm going to be bullish on them winning those games wherever they were there, but I feel really confident playing any of those 4 teams. This is not the upper echelon of the Eastern Conference. It's all the rest, especially a team like the Washington Wizards, who I think have just been, in perpetuity, a bit of a disaster. So, that's the other reason that I am confident around it, especially if we assume you get to that place. Now, if they fall from 6th to 10th, that means things have gone pretty bad for them and my expectations would change. But I'm assuming they stay on the upper edge of that. Maybe they do stay clear of the play-in game. I'm pretty bullish about them being able to take on those teams that currently sit behind them.
Yeah, the Nets are uniquely positioned here for this final stretch of games because, one, we know that they're not really built to be a great playoff team. That's just what happens when you trade away your best players. That's just how the NBA works. You want to have players, you want to have superstars that can play 40 minutes a game in the playoffs. That's the whole. Yeah. That's basically the recipe. The Nets do not have that, but they are very, as we talked about on many podcasts leading up to this, the Nets are a very deep team. The Nets are actually a good regular season team because it's actually hard to get away from them. If your opponents, their second units are going to be running into elite defensive combinations here, yeah. Almost like the entire 48 or 240 minutes or 48 minutes of the game. So the Nets actually are not an easy out from a regular season standpoint going forward here, just because they have lots of real players. They don't have any superstars, but they have lots of good / above average players. And from a regular season build, that does have a very high floor. You combine that with, there's no motivation for them to, there's a little motivation if you wanted to keep your own draft pick, because it's not going to convey to Houston with the pick swap this year, but they just have too many wins. So it's just doesn't matter. It would be impossible. It'd be impossible almost for them to get into the lottery.
I'll cut you off this time. That'd be the old, try to get yourself dumpstered down, but the team is too good to lose the games you need to, and it ends up not working out anyway, right?
Even if they wanted to do it, even if they were hey, it actually does make sense to try to get a lottery pick this year because we have our own. And I think there is a world where that would have made sense. They couldn't do it for 2 reasons. 1, they banked too many wins. 2, they're too good. We just said, yeah. To be one of those teams, you have to have do what OKC did last year. It's hey, here's 5 guys you never heard of that are going to play 48 minutes a game. Enjoy it, right? They literally did that at the end of the year. It was a total mess. The Nets don't even have the personnel to be able to do that. They have too many good players. So even, look, if you started Patty Mills and Joe Harris every game, you'd probably lose, right? But they're not going to do that. So I think that they're just in a unique position. It's actually cool from a fan perspective because I think we have from a fan.
There's a floor,
dude.
Right?
We have a great rooting interest here to be let's see what we have. Let's root really hard for a team we know is going to play hard here because everyone's playing for a contract and everyone's playing to kind of keep the floor, their own floor high, and they're just going to be good enough to actually root for, right? Yeah. So I think that I think even as fans, we're uniquely positioned to kind of go along for the ride of these last 24 games with the team.
And also, just when we talk about expectations for this team, trade deadline, you pass through some of those guys. Some of these guys that come in, you pass them through and they go somewhere else for more assets. You do reduce the roster so it isn't good enough to win enough basketball games if you want to go that route.
If you were tanking, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. If you want to do that, there's a way to get there. You jettison a handful of good players, so there isn't enough good talent here. That wasn't the expectation. And we said this going all the way back to the offseason when all this stuff kicked up around Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. It was, no matter what, the Brooklyn Nets cannot afford to go into tank mode with this franchise because it took too long to build up to that. And we've seen, you mentioned OKC, you can't go into purgatory for half a decade or more if you're a team in a major market, regardless of if it's viewed secondary to New York and the Knicks. It's a major market. You can't afford to disappear like that. Let's close out, though. I want to ask you, there's 24 games left. I've looked over like the schedule. There's some nice ones, a couple games against Orlando, Detroit's mixed in there. And just in general, like I said, hey, 500 ball. Do you have that expectation over the 24 games before we get into like specific player expectations here and what it can mean? Do you feel like from a talent standpoint, knowing it's a mixed bag of schedule, that they can play 500 basketball?
I actually just funny about 500 because
I think better than that, but that's my floor.
Yeah. But I think it's funny about that because I actually, when I look at this team, I just think average team. Like that's what they are. They're kind of just an average team. Like they have no superstars, depending on what you think Bridges ends up getting to, right? Like he's probably the guy that has probably the highest ceiling of anyone on the team, or he just does. That's not even a hot take. But in terms so they're clearly not a great team. They're not a bad team because they just have too many just good rotational guys on the squad here. I think they're motivated to be like sort of around. I think they're motivated to probably punch a little bit above their weight in terms of just like whatever maybe the sum is greater than the whole of the parts or however that saying goes. So I do think of them as kind of just like an average team. That's fine. But that would be around a 500 team, right? Like if everything kind of breaks right, that's around 500. And 500 for them is good enough at this point. And 500 for them keeps them out of the play-in game probably. And
by the way,
I don't know, like that's fine.
Over a whole season, like 500 ball right now, you'd be the 8th seed above the Atlanta Hawks. Like, just to put it into context. Like, and expectations, the record is separate from expectations of what you want to accomplish. But again, a full season, chemistry, development, our perspectives and opinions would evolve and change about that. But to your point, purely from a talent standpoint, that's where I think they are. And on a game-to-game basis, hey, watch out. They just beat a team that's a few rungs above them in the standings. Totally doable. And maybe they do have a clunker where the offense isn't quite clicking and you feel like you drop one that you shouldn't have, which I think is reasonable. And that's why I am excited about the back half where you go, change my opinion. Right? Change my opinion over these 24 games. Make me feel like, you know what? You're even a little bit better than a 500 team. You are a team that could win 46 games in a year as currently comprised, regardless of any changes that happen. And that, again, like that does get me excited because it means I have an uncertainty around what this is in a good way.
Yeah. And as we said many times, we've said, and I'm going to formulate this into a math problem. It's like, culture equals wins divided by expectation, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's kind of where we've deemed culture to be something along some kind of math problem like that. It's like how many wins you have divided by your expectation. If you have X amount if you have a 500 record worth of wins and your expectation was, the championship, then your culture stinks. If you have 500, if you have 500 wins and everyone thought you were going to be a lottery team, your culture is amazing, right? So the Nets are in that latter group right now. So when you said Atlanta, it's like, yeah, they're a 500 team. Well, that's a disaster because they have Trae Young and they traded for DeJounte Murray, and it's just like, and it's a total mess, right? These expectations around the team are just totally different around this Nets squad. So 500 is just fine for look, you don't want to do this for 5 straight years, right? Like we would start
exactly. That's a really
which by the way, they did. And we kind of ran the course on the D'Lo, Karras, Jared Allen group. Right. And eventually you need to cycle out of that, but where they are now, hold on. We're going to get into this in a second. I know you want to jump in here, but I gotta tell you about our friends in Built Bar 1 second. But like when you've reset the cultural expectations around the team, then like those numbers are all of a sudden way more palatable than they ever were in the past. And I know Adam has strong thoughts about that, which we are going to get to in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. We are almost to March. I can't even believe this calendar's fly by with this few games left in the NBA season, but maybe you're a little far afield of those New Year's resolutions that you made about health, about eating healthy. It's all right. Get back on the right train here with Built Bar. Built Bar combined 2 things that we need: health and great taste. And believe me, this is harder than you think, but Built Bar figured it out. They started with the flavors like peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. They're not candy bars. They're actual protein bars that taste great with the stats to back it up. 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, 17 grams of protein. You can get them at built.com. You can go over to Sam's Club. You go to Walmart, really anywhere where you're going to get those boxes. They're going to be good to add to your supply. Go to built.com right now. Grab yourself a brownie batter, grab a churro. You'll thank me later. Built.com.
Okay. So the first thing that I just wanted to touch on there before we talk about what certain players can accomplish for themselves and ultimately for the team and the way we look at them over the remainder of the season and pushing towards what will be another big offseason for Brooklyn. You mentioned the last iteration of this 500 team, plucky going to the playoffs, and Spencer Dinwiddie was a part of that. The one thing I'll make very clear is we know what Jarrett Allen turned into, but go back and look at that roster. This is now a far better roster than that. In my opinion, like the totality of the parts that you're talking about. Karis LeVert never turned into that next iteration of whatever we thought maybe he could have been. And even you and I at the time of the Harden trade said, yeah, fans are overvaluing what he's going to be. The depth, the consistency, the experience, like what they did differently here is that was young and plucky and surprising some people. This version of the team, even in the short term, is still some youth like Claxton, like Cam Thomas, but then experience with Spencer Dinwiddie, DFS, experience even with Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, because they've been around the league for a handful of years and played on teams that have had playoff experience. So I think that actually, the NBA changes every single season, but in that regard, I would put this iteration of the team a rung or two above that version. Now, the caveat is that version overachieved. So them being, a 500 team and making it is going to look different for this team and where expectations go as well.
Yeah, look, that's just kind of sometimes this is where you reset your landscape to be, right? Like it's just where in terms of the players you have and the expectation levels around them. And you mentioned LeVert and guys like that. Like this is what sort of happens when you are on different timelines with who your players are, right? Like, is that kind of what you're getting at? Like in terms of thinking about who you have on the roster as compared to what you want to think about for the future?
Oh, 100%. Back then, it didn't matter. There was no expectations of competing for a championship, so it was all great. This team isn't expected to compete for a championship, but they are expected. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson. I want to ask some questions about other players like DFS and Dinwiddie, but those two players specifically, who are buddies off the court and hopefully buddies on the court, as they've been said now, thing one and thing two with their number selections. The expectations for them is show that you can be a part of this nucleus that can have a higher expectation than just making the playoffs. Like whatever their ceiling is going to be and moves that may get made down the road, as currently constructed, those players need to show that we can win a first round playoff series. And then we'll see where we go from there. We can be a concerning threat in a second round series for certain teams. Like I think that bar of expectations is going to change when we talk about what are the moves that the team makes going forward. What other players do they try to bring in here? I think that is starkly different than the other version. Not in this moment. We're all just happy to have some talent and have some fun, but that's what I think it's building towards, unlike what they thought back then. Back then, they thought, we're just trying to build to a point where we can attract big superstars. Now I'd say you feel like you're just one other key piece maybe away from moving the needle.
Yeah, and I think they bought themselves some time with that too. Like again, they banked a bunch of wins, and the expectations are gonna be a little lower here because the team is kind of new together, right? Like they're not gonna have a lot of time together to play. Now, funny thing is, none of these Nets teams ever had time to play together because they never played, never all on the court at the same time in any iteration.
Change that kind of consistency that they have too. You can change that pattern if you want. You can have.
Yeah, I'd love to have not like, hey, 23rd starting lineup is for this season. That's pretty amazing. Right. We're starting a lineup in the playoffs that we've never seen in the regular season. That's kind of awesome. Like that kind of happened last year. Yeah, so they've also bought themselves time with this too. Like the expectations are going to be low here, but you will be able to also get a little taste of what it could look like in the future. I think that's kind of a great spot. It's a little house money-ish in terms of like how they might view themselves, with the chance to really surprise people in terms of like how far they go. And if they got swept out of the playoffs, I don't think anyone would care, except that we would be bummed. But does that make sense? Like I think that they're just in a good spot when it comes to that.
Oh no, and I think like the way you play matters in those games, right? Yeah. Remember, again, go back to the previous iteration. They got swept by Philadelphia, but there were like 2 out of those 4 games were really competitive where there was this road. You go, oh man, you could have taken one or two, and that was more than enough, right?
Dude,
Like
I had people like saying that was the last time they had a great time rooting for the Nets was like that specific series.
And Keith McPherson brought this up when we did the crossover at the start of the week, where he said, he's like, guess what the expectations are? Make the playoffs, play-ins or otherwise. If you make the play-in, get out of that play-in. He goes, if you win one game, you're on par with the team from last year with the superstars. So guess what? Like the threshold for success and the way the fans are going to feel about it, it doesn't take a lot to get there. On the end of this, I will ask you a question about expectations ultimately, but I know we want to talk about Cam Thomas, and we've already discussed him, and I think we will continue, and we're going to see what comes of this. But the one thing I found fascinating was Cam Johnson, when he came over from Phoenix, the reports were that Phoenix didn't want to go to the 4-year, I think it was 72 or 76 million, whatever it was. They didn't want to meet that expectation that Cam Johnson was looking for in the extension. Knowing that relationship, how much more for you would Cam Johnson need to show over the back half of this season to get to the offseason and say, yeah, you're worth that 20 million-ish a year? And you can go and look at guys around the league. Some look like really good deals. Some look a little worse. But is it unreasonable to set that expectation knowing what it means to this new current core of this team?
With Cam Johnson specifically, you mean? Like,
yeah, and I guess as it pertains to what you need to see from him. Like, can you, in your mind, can you see something different now in a larger and expanding role here with Brooklyn, where you go, by the end of the year, I go, yeah, that is a $20 million a year player. Unlike, other iterations or being in Phoenix where you'd say, sorry, you're 4 or 5 guys down the totem pole here. It'd be hard for us to go that way with you.
Yeah, it could have been a money crunch there with the Suns for sure, right? Like with him specifically. Right. And it's funny on him. The sample size is like kind of there, but not really. He's only started 55 games as an NBA player. 55, like in his whole career, has not started a full NBA start. He's played more of those games, but he's not started a full NBA season's worth of games, which is interesting.
17 he picked up coming back from his injury this year with Phoenix. Got right into the starting
like they're all like a third of them were this season, right? Yeah. Now he's going to have an expanded role though. Like he's already playing more minutes here than he has at any other stop. So like you're going to be able to just see more. So I think there's like some world where Phoenix didn't want to go there because they had their sights set in a slightly different direction, right? And they just have a lot more money. They had a ton of money in the books too. Like they just had Ayton and Booker and they had CP and they maybe wanted to consolidate into Kevin Durant. Like it was going to be, and they had Bridges too at the time. It was going to be hard to maybe actually pony up that amount of money for him. I think he is definitely playing for a contract here in terms of like what the Nets will offer him. It's funny about where teams set their sights. The fact that it probably helps him a lot that he was included in the Kevin Durant trade. Right. Like when you were part of a trade that brought back Kevin Durant, at that point, like you just get helped a lot by just having your name associated with that trade. And if they were to not re-sign him, it would probably look a little weird. So I think that actually probably helps him from that standpoint. And we definitely just have to see a lot more from him also over these last few games. And he's going to have a chance. He's going to have more of a chance to show it now than he has at other stops. Like already the usage is higher and the minutes are higher than he's ever played before. So sometimes that can just help also.
The one other bow I think we can tie in this, we'll get out the door, is remember that the Spencer Dinwiddie and Dorian Finney-Smith trade was about getting Kyrie out. And I'd be really curious to hear from Sean Marks and the Nets of saying, and that was a move to still keep Kevin Durant versus no matter what, those were going to be good players to have here. And I actually can agree that they were. Like they're still quality players to be a part of this. But when it comes to what they accomplish in the short term, I don't know if either one of those guys will do anything short of really, stepping up in a massive way, that they'll do anything over these final 24 that going into the offseason and going into next year and next year's deadline, that the Nets organization will say these are two 29, 30-year-old guys, good championship contending contributors. Like I think that those guys, if we would just want to take the high level view, those guys can be earmarked for, and how do we keep replenishing our draft capital? How do we keep making adjustments to this roster? There's more than a few players here that are not necessarily here for the long haul. Like, how much of this roster do you think might not be here after one off season? Because that's like an interesting thing. I'm not bringing it down. It's actually a good thing for Brooklyn. But Seth Curry, Joe Harris, Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, like, those are 4 guys that might not be a part of what the new construction looks like beyond this year.
Yeah, all a little different, reasoning. I mean, Dinwiddie has non-guarantee money, although it's not exactly clear what number that is for next year at 21 million. You could definitely see him as an expiring going out the door if they were just that was going to look different for a sort of part of the rebuild. Finney-Smith is like under a really reasonable number here through 25, 26. So I don't know.
Maybe I'm misstating putting him in that actually.
I'm not sure though, because you can also have like sometimes too many wings that aren't enough on-ball creators, and you can have sort of tragedy of the commons when it comes to that too. And so I think that he's an interesting case that they at some point you can have too many dudes like of the same archetype, right. and those guys have value elsewhere too. So I don't totally disagree with the fact that part that he might not be part of it long term. I would definitely agree with the Dinwiddie piece. The Harris thing, he's going to be expiring. It's hard to see him part of a rebuild. Curry, same kind of thing. So I do think we're going to see another little mini reset on the players, but I do think probably, I mean, Bridges for sure. I mean, Simmons is still here. I could see Simmons, Bridges, Finney-Smith, and I could see them re-signing Cam Johnson and having him part of that for the piece I just mentioned too. It's like, hey, you came over the Durant trade, and that gives you immediate value to make sure that like we got something back.
Yep.
So I can see that being part of it too. But the other guys too, like if you're 30 years and older, like, yeah, I would say that this is probably the end of the line.
I know we're getting out the door here, but the last thing, since it's the All-Star break and we're coming back, you think the Nets make the playoffs?
Yeah.
Do they win a playoff game?
No. Oh, win a playoff game? Sorry.
Just win a playoff game. Like out of the play-in, they go to the official first round.
Nah, they don't. I don't think they do. Because one thing about that is that I think that while I think the Nets are built really well for a regular season, remember, when you get to the playoffs, everyone just plays their best 5. So the Nets have like a really good 12, right? But they don't have an elite 5 or 6. And I think that's what wins in the playoffs. So like all these games where, when you play, play the Bucks, right? Well, they'll play the Bucks coming up here. Giannis will play 34 minutes. In the playoffs, Giannis will play 40 minutes, right? Like those, the math just changes. And so I think the Nets don't really have like another level to go to like that some of these other teams do. But I mean, could they win a game? I don't want to have that on the record that I got that one wrong. So
the Nets will win a playoff game. The Nets
you got it. All right. We're going to get out of here. Good to be back from the All-Star break. Good to be just back in the swing. And that's things. So sometimes just feels a little too long. You try to satiate yourself with the dunk contest and the 3-point contest. And I'll tell you right now, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, folks. But make sure that if you are along for the ride, if you're new here coming out of the break, make sure you subscribe over to Locked On Nets YouTube. Subscribe Locked On Nets wherever you listen to the podcast. Totally free ways to help the show, and they really, really help us. Subscribe wherever you listen.
I've got a bright future ahead of me. Justin Bieber.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.